Hello, and welcome to Accidental Transcendental. If you've never stumbled on me before, thanks for boldly clicking. My name's Paul, and this is my little project, stretching its legs today, onto a new platform, into a new medium. If you have followed the show up until now, or dipped in and out, welcome back. Thank you for continuing the journey with me. If you're listening on my usual audio-only platforms, feel free to follow the show notes to YouTube for my first ever video podcast. Something that has not appealed to me until now. It still feels unfamiliar, uncomfortable even, but presents an invitation to grow in a new direction. And maybe, hopefully, the opportunity to make some new connections, to open the door to some interesting conversations. So, aside from sitting in front of a camera, the main changes? There's no co-host Lumen as we move forwards. Just me and a mic, speaking to you directly for the first time. Why now? It just feels like a natural moment for a pivot, a fresh start. I've whizzed through a lot of complex ideas over the last few years, all of them helpful in their own way, some of them very abstract, a lot of them presented in a much longer read-only form. So I'm attempting to do something different here, to walk through a lighter, more human path, mindful of how big everyone's read lists are, and just how busy and complex 2026 lives have become. That's my entry point to being in front of you here today. I'm grateful of your time and company. Right then, let's jump in. I've been noticing something for a while now, and I'm not sure exactly when it started to become obvious. But it's one of those things, once you see it, you can't quite unsee. It's not just in my own life, it's everywhere. In conversations, in relationships, in the news, in the way people talk to each other, in the way people don't talk to each other. It just feels like we're all trying. We're trying to understand things, trying to improve things, trying to move forward, trying to get somewhere that feels a bit more stable, a bit more clear. And yet, a lot of the time, it just doesn't seem to click. You can have a conversation with someone and it goes round in circles. You can know what you need to do and still not do it. You can try to explain something really clearly and it just doesn't land. And then you zoom out a bit and the world itself starts to feel like that. Noisy, fast, fragmented. Like everyone's speaking, but not necessarily hearing each other. And for a long time, I think I did what most of us do, which is to assume that something was wrong. Either with me, or with them, or with the situation. Like if I just thought about it hard enough, or explained it a little better, or found the right angle, something would eventually fall into place. And to be fair, sometimes it does. You get those little moments where something clicks and you think, right, I've got it now. And then, a week later, you're back in it again. And I've taken the scenic route with all of this stuff, properly. Looping around the same patterns, thinking I'd figured something out, then realising I hadn't. Then figuring out a slightly deeper version. And so on, over and over again. But somewhere along the way, I started to notice something slightly different. Not a final answer, not a clean solution, just a pattern. And it wasn't a pattern that said, here's how you fix everything. It was more like, this might be what's actually going on underneath it all. Because what I started to realise is we're often trying to fix things at the wrong layer. We're trying to solve confusion with more information. We're trying to solve stuckness with more effort. We're trying to solve disconnection by pushing harder to be understood. And sometimes that works. But a lot of the time, it just creates more noise. So what I want to do here isn't give you a set of answers. I don't think I've got those. And honestly, I'm not sure that's how this works. What I can do is walk you through a few things that I've been noticing over a long period of time that have started to make all of this feel a little more coherent, a little less confusing, a little easier to move through, even when nothing is fully resolved. And again, this isn't something I've nailed. I still get this wrong all the time. But when I do remember this stuff, things feel different. So, let's start somewhere really simple. Because one of the biggest shifts for me came from realizing something that sounds obvious, but isn't when you really feel into it. We're not all seeing the same world. And I don't just mean that in a poetic way. I mean it quite literally. Because for a long time, I think I assumed that if two people were in the same situation, hearing the same words, seeing the same things, we were, more or less, experiencing the same reality. And the more I paid attention, the less true that seems. You probably had this moment where you're in a conversation with someone and it starts off fine. And then somewhere along the way, it just drifts. You're saying something that feels really clear to you. They're responding in a way that doesn't quite match. You try to clarify, they double down, and after a while, you're both kind of talking past each other. And you walk away thinking, what just happened there? And the easy explanation is, they didn't understand me, or I didn't explain it properly, or they're just wrong. And sometimes, sure, that's part of it. But what I've started to notice is, it's often something a little deeper than that. It's not just that we're disagreeing. It's that we're not actually starting from the same place. It's like we're all looking at the world through our own set of lenses. Everything we've experienced, everything we've learned, what's worked for us, what hasn't, what we've had to protect ourselves from, and what we've learned to trust. It all builds up into this filter, and we don't really notice it because we're inside it. So when we look out at the world, it just feels like reality. But someone else is looking through a completely different filter, and to them, that feels like reality. So when those two perspectives meet, it's not just a difference of opinion. It's a difference in what even counts as true. And that changes things. Because if that's the case, then a lot of the friction we experience isn't coming from people being irrational, or stubborn, or difficult. It's coming from people being completely coherent within the reality they're seeing. Which is a bit uncomfortable, because it means I'm doing that too. There are things that feel obviously true to me, that someone else looks at and thinks, how are you seeing it like that? And from their perspective, they're not wrong. They're just seeing something different. And once that started to land for me, it didn't magically fix anything, but it did soften something. It made it a bit easier to step back and think, okay, maybe this isn't about winning the conversation. Maybe it's about understanding where this person is actually standing. Not so I can agree with everything, not so I can lose my perspective, but just to recognize we're not arguing over the same piece of ground. And that alone explains a lot of what feels broken. But it also leads to another problem. Because even when something does make sense, even when you do see something clearly, that still doesn't mean everything's going to change. And this one took me a while to really accept, because it goes against something we're kind of taught to believe, which is that if you understand something properly, you'll be able to act on it. Like, once you know what's good for you, you'll just do it. Eat better, rest more, have the difficult conversation, leave the thing that isn't working, start the thing that matters. And again, sometimes that does happen. You get a moment of clarity, and it leads to action, and something genuinely shifts. But more often than not, at least in my experience, it doesn't quite work like that. You can know exactly what would help you and still not do it. You can understand a pattern you're stuck in, see it clearly, explain it to someone else, and then find yourself right back in it again. Same reaction, same habits, same loops. And that's the point where it's really easy to turn on yourself. Why am I still doing this? I know better than this. What's wrong with me? I've had plenty of those moments. And what I've started to realize is that whole line of thinking is based on a bit of a misunderstanding, because it assumes that change is just about insight, but there's something else going on underneath that. And the simplest way I've found to describe it is capacity, because it's not just about whether something makes sense. It's about whether you can actually hold it, whether you have the space, the energy, the stability, the support to live the change consistently. And those aren't always there. You might be tired, overwhelmed, stretched too thin, in an environment that doesn't support it, carrying things you haven't fully processed yet. So even if the direction is right, The system you're operating in can't quite sustain it. And when you look at it like that, it changes the tone a bit. It's not about pushing harder or trying to be more disciplined. It's about asking, what would actually make this possible for me right now? And sometimes the answer isn't do the big thing. Sometimes it's do less. Simplify something, rest properly, remove a bit of pressure, ask for support, take a smaller step that actually fits. And that can feel frustrating because it's slower. It's not that big dramatic shift where everything changes overnight. But it's often the difference between something that lasts and something that collapses a week later. And I still fall into this all the time. I'll see something clearly, get all excited about it, try to implement it at full intensity, and then wonder why it just doesn't stick. And more often than not, it's because I've tried to jump straight to a version of myself that I can't quite sustain yet. So now I'm a bit more interested in what I can actually hold. What fits? What's realistic? What can be repeated? Because that's the stuff that tends to be built. And once you can see that, it explains something else as well. Because it's not just about you and your capacity. It's also about everything around you. Because for a long time, I think I treated everything as it was just internal. If something wasn't working, it must be me, my habits, my mindset, my discipline, my ability to follow through. And again, there's some truth in that, but it's not the whole picture. Because one of the things I started noticing was how different I felt in different environments. Same person, same intentions, same general understanding of what I wanted to do, but completely different results. There are places where things feel easy. You think clearly, you speak more openly, you follow through on things. You feel a bit more yourself. And then there are other places where everything feels heavier. You hesitate more, you second guess yourself, you get pulled back into old patterns, you react in ways you thought you moved past. And for a while, that was confusing because it felt inconsistent. Like, why can I be this version of myself over here, but not over there? And the answer isn't always obvious because we tend to think of ourselves as a fixed thing. But what I've started to see is we're not just operating in isolation. We're part of fields, relationships, groups, environments, systems, and those things have a huge influence on what becomes possible. Not in a dramatic, controlling way, but in a subtle, constant way. Some environments expand you. They give you room, they support certain behaviors, they make it easier to access parts of yourself that are already there. And others constrain you, not necessarily because anyone's doing anything wrong, but because the fit isn't quite there. The expectations are different, the energy is different, the patterns are different. So even if you try to change something, you're doing it inside conditions that may or may not support that change. And when you see that, something shifts again. Because it's not just, what do I need to do differently? It becomes, what conditions am I trying to do this within? And that can be quite revealing. Because sometimes the issue isn't that you're not capable. It's that the environment you're in doesn't give that capacity much room to exist. And that doesn't mean you immediately walk away from everything that's difficult. Some of the most meaningful growth happens inside of challenging environments. But it does mean you start paying attention to the field itself, where you place yourself, who you're around, what you're consistently exposed to. Because none of those things are neutral. They shape what feels possible and what feels almost impossible. And once that starts to land, it explains something else. Because even when you do find something that works, even when the conditions line up, even when something finally feels stable, that's not the end of the story either. Because when something does start to work, it's a relief. Things feel clearer, more manageable, a bit more predictable. You find a way of doing things that makes sense. A way of thinking, a routine, a role, a set of beliefs. Something that gives you a bit of stability. And naturally, you build around it. You rely on it, you repeat it, you refine it. And for a while, that's exactly what you need. Because without some form of stability, everything feels chaotic. So this part is important. It's not wrong. But what I didn't really see for a long time is that the same process can quietly turn into something else. Because the thing that helped you starts to become something you feel you need to hold on to. Not just use, but protect. And it happens subtly. You stop questioning in quite the same way. You start filtering new information through it. You feel a bit more resistant when something challenges it. Not necessarily because you're being rigid, but because it's tied to something that worked. It gave you footing, and letting go of that, even slightly, can feel like stepping back into uncertainty. So instead, we double down. We defend it, we explain it, we refine it further. And again, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But over time, it can start to close things down. Because now, anything that doesn't fit that structure feels like a threat, even if that thing might actually be the next step. And this doesn't just happen individually. You see it in relationships, in families, in organizations, in communities. Ways of doing things that once made total sense, slowly becoming fixed and then defended, even when the conditions have changed, even where the fit isn't quite right anymore. And this is where a lot of friction starts to build. Because from the inside, it still feels coherent. But from the outside, it looks rigid or outdated or unnecessarily limiting. And that gap creates tension. Between people, between groups, between versions of yourself. Because part of you is saying, this works, stay here. And another part of you is saying, this doesn't quite fit anymore. And that can be a really uncomfortable place to sit, because there's no clear signal that says, now is the moment to let go. It's more of a gradual sense of something tightening. Something that used to feel alive, starting to feel a bit constrained. And for me, this has been one of the harder things to navigate. Because it means accepting that some of the things that genuinely helped me are not meant to carry me forever. And that doesn't make them wrong. It just means the job has changed. But letting go of something that once helped you doesn't feel like progress. It feels like loss. So we hesitate. We hold on a bit longer than we need to. We try to make it work again. We tweak it. We explain it until eventually something gives and we're forced to move. Or we choose to. And once you start to see that pattern, it reframes things yet again. Because now it's not just about finding something that works. It's about staying aware of when it stops working in the way it used to, without turning that into a failure, without turning it into something to defend. Just recognizing that movement is still happening, even here. And that brings up a slightly different question. If all of this is true, if we're seeing different things, holding different capacities, moving through different environments, and constantly building and outgrowing structures, then how do you actually move well through all of that? And I don't think the answer to that is another system, or a perfect method, or something you apply once and then everything just works from that point on. I've looked for that. I don't think it exists. But what I have started to notice is that there is a different way of relating to all of this. Not controlling, not fixing, not solving it once and for all, but moving within it differently. And a lot of that starts with something quite simple. Paying attention to what actually helps and what just makes more noise. Because not everything that's loud is useful. Not everything that's urgent is important. And not everything that feels intense is moving you in the right direction. There's a lot of input, a lot of advice, a lot of opinions, a lot of this is how you should do it. And if you try to take all of that on, it becomes overwhelming very quickly. So one of the first shifts for me has just been reducing that, stepping back a bit, letting things go quiet enough to actually hear something more subtle. Because the signals that seem to matter most aren't usually the loud ones. They're the ones that are consistent. The things that still feel true when everything else dies down a bit. And alongside that, there's something about rhythm that I've had to learn the hard way. Because I used to think that progress looked like constant movement. Always pushing forward, always improving, always doing more. And if I wasn't doing that, it felt like I was slipping. But in reality, that's not how anything seems to work. There are phases where things open up, where energy is there, where things move quickly. And there are phases where everything slows down, where things are quieter or heavier or a bit stuck. And for a long time, I treated those quieter phases as a problem, something to fix. But more often than not, they were actually doing something important, integrating something, settling something, making space for whatever comes next. And when I try to override that, when I try to force momentum, that's when things usually get messy. So now I'm a bit more interested in working with that rhythm rather than against it. Letting things expand when they expand, letting them contract when they need to. Not perfectly, but a bit more consciously. And then there's something else that's become really important, which is how we relate to other people. Because if we're all seeing things slightly differently and moving through different environments, then forcing agreement isn't always the answer. Sometimes it's just about being able to exist alongside difference without everything turning into conflict. What I've started to think of as good neighbourliness, not needing everyone to think the same way, not needing to resolve every difference, but having enough respect, enough awareness, enough restraint to let things coexist without constant friction. And that doesn't mean you have to accept everything. It doesn't mean you don't have boundaries or standards or things that matter to you. It just means you don't have to fight every difference as if it's a threat. And then maybe the last piece is something around identity. Because it's very easy to build a version of yourself that makes sense and then feel like you have to stay that way. This is who I am. This is what I believe. This is how I do things. And again, that can be really stabilizing. But it can also become quite restrictive if it stops you from changing. So I've been trying, and not always successfully, to hold things a little more lightly, to let myself evolve without feeling like I'm losing something every time. Because the alternative is getting stuck defending a version of yourself that you've already outgrown. And when you put all of that together, it's not a perfect system. It's more like a different posture. A way of standing in the middle of all this movement without needing it to stop. Paying attention to the signal, respecting your capacity, working with rhythm, being able to live alongside difference, and not locking yourself into something too rigid. It doesn't solve everything, but it does make things feel more navigable and a bit less chaotic and a bit more grounded. And maybe that's enough. And I don't think there's a final version of this where everything just clicks into place and stays there. I don't think there's a point where you figure it all out, lock it in, and then just live that way forever. Because everything keeps moving. Life changes, people change, you change. The things that make sense right now might not make sense in the same way later. The things that feel difficult now might become easier, and something else takes their place. So I don't think the goal is to reach some kind of final clarity, or to eliminate uncertainty completely. I think it's more about learning how to stay orientated, even as things shift. And that's not something you get once. It's something you keep returning to. You notice when things feel off. You step back a little. You listen more carefully. You adjust. Not perfectly, just enough. And again, I still get this wrong all the time. I still push when I probably should pause. Hold on to things a bit too long. Get caught up in the noise. Forget what actually helps. But I notice a bit sooner now. And that seems to be the difference. Not that everything's solved, but that I don't stay stuck in the same way. So if there's anything to take from this, it's probably not a set of instructions. It's more of an orientation. Pay attention to what actually helps. Be honest about what you can hold. Notice the environments you're in. Allow things to change. And don't feel like you have to lock yourself into one fixed way of being. That's most of it. And beyond that, I think it's okay that we're all still figuring this out. There may not be a final map for all of this, but there is a way of moving through it that feels a bit more coherent and a bit more grounded, a bit more yours, and maybe that's enough. So, that's me done for today. Thank you for spending this time with me. This is the first episode of a new season of Accidental Transcendental, a slightly different shape for the show, and hopefully a clearer, more spacious one. Season 1 was the walk itself, messy, sincere, exploratory, occasionally overstuffed, and very much unfolding in real time. Season 2 is me returning to some of those same landscapes, with a little more distance, a little more structure, and hopefully a little more humour along the way. If this resonated, you can find the earlier audio episodes, companion blogs, and the Evergreen Essays at accidentaltranscendental.com. Those essays go much deeper into the ideas we've only lightly touched upon today. And next time, when we return, we'll begin with one of the strangest and most useful questions that I keep coming back to. What if human experience is a kind of low-resolution rendering of something much larger? Until then, I've been Paul. This has been Accidental Transcendental, and I hope you'll stay curious enough to see where the adventure takes us next.